Oh, goody.
All right, what's going on, everybody? Zombies here again, and today we're back with another Marvel Snap video. So in this one, I wanted to talk a little bit about Hulkling. There's been so much discussion about this card, and a lot of it has been, hey, they should really buff this card because it doesn't seem very good. It's not too great. It's just not a card that I think a lot of people are super excited about. So clearly, Second Dinner should buff it and change that. And I wanted to provide a little bit of a different perspective on that topic that I think is kind of interesting to dive into. So in its present form, is Hulkling a good card? It's not great. I don't think it's a card most people are going to want to pick up. And I think the main thing that has contributed to a lot of this discussion is the fact that so many cards that have been releasing in the past few months have been very meta relevant cards. A bunch of which slot into multiple decks and pretty meaningfully impact how the game is played. And I don't think Hulkling does that. But at the same time, I don't think Hulkling needs to do that. And I think this is a good lesson in not every card they release has to have a huge impact on the metagame. Obviously, you want a lot of cards that release to have a big impact on the metagame. Otherwise, it feels like there's no purpose to picking them up. But I think there is a lot of room for cards that are kind of more mid, not necessarily bad, but have a very niche purpose and a smaller target audience. But, you know, people still like those cards. People still play those cards. And I've seen a lot of people actually having fun with the current iteration of Hulkling. Now, is it possible they could stand to give this card an additional point of power? Sure. I'm not super opposed to that idea, but some of the other buffs I've seen suggested just seem flat out insane to me. So I kind of wanted to talk about that, why I think it's good at the current rate it is, as well as what causes these kind of feelings about wanting these cards that are like mediocre to really get pushed to the moon. So by far the most common buff I think I've seen for Hulkling has been players wanting him to be a 5-cost card. And personally, I think that one would be a massive mistake. We can even see from the developer answers, apparently Hulkling was originally a 5-cost card that they deemed to just be too powerful. And I think it would be too powerful. Obviously, it would have lower numbers. It probably wouldn't still be an 11 power card. But if the text was still rolling 6-drops, some of the 6s in this game are so incredibly powerful being played one turn ahead of curve. We've seen a lot of that with Arsham. And Hulkling would, I think, enable more of it. The other thing with Hulkling is, I think just by the nature of the design of this card, this is not a card you want to be a huge meta card. Think about how annoyed people get losing to the random cards created by Arsham. Is that not like one of the biggest things you see people get frustrated and complain about with Arsham? For me, that's the thing I see the most in terms of complaints about Arsham. Is the fact that people don't like the fact that they can't realistically play around all these randomly generated cards. And the thing with Hulkling is, when Hulkling is bad and you get a bad roll, your opponent doesn't see that. They don't know you have a Hulkling because you're not playing the Hulkling. When it makes an Infinite or a Giganto, you're just not playing it. So the only time they're going to see the Hulkling is when it's doing good stuff. And so it might not be doing good stuff all the time, but it creates this kind of confirmation bias where people see Hulkling when it does really good stuff, and then people think it's a really busted card, even if it might not be. I think that's true with the design of the card in its current form. It's just costed in a way where I think that most decks won't end up making space for it, whereas at 5 cost, I think a lot of decks would make space for it. So I totally believe Second Dinner when they're saying, yeah, this card was too strong at 5. I've also seen some people suggest some massive point buffs, like one person suggesting it go to 14 or 15 power, which I think is quite absurd. I don't even know what to say about that other than people, I think, underestimate how much power per energy is actually like on rate. I think if you gave 14 or 15 power to most of the 6-drops in this game, they would be pretty busted. So I don't think that is likely to happen. I mean, if they really want to bump it up by 1 power, I don't think that's the end of the world or anything if he really is underperforming, but I think it's a little bit too early to tell on that front. So even if Hulkling is buffed and becomes meta, you can't realistically play around this card because the variance is just too high to know what they're going to be doing with it. Are they going to get a Dr. Doom, an Eliath, a Zola, a Leader? You can't realistically play around all those things at the same time. So for that reason, I think this is a card that would create huge amounts of frustration if it was a popular meta card. So it's better off being this kind of more middling, fun RNG Timmy card than something that is actually going to be like a mainstay in the meta. And that brings me to, I think, the more interesting part of this discussion, which is, why is there this pressure to want every card to be a meta impacting card? Obviously, players want new cards to be good, so they feel like they have a reason to play and to purchase them. And I think this issue is really, really exacerbated by every card being a Series 5 card currently. When I think back to when we still got Series 4 card releases, one of the ones that is really striking to me is, I think at the very start of them releasing Series 4 on release cards, one of the cards that was included there was Mirage. And I think she is a textbook example of how the difference between a Series 5 and a Series 4 card really changes how people are perceiving the card and how much they desire it and desire it to be a playable, meta impactful card. Mirage has really never been a super meta card. She certainly wasn't on release. And I think that card would have gotten a lot more criticism if it came out as a Series 5 card. More people would have wanted them to buff it, because it's just hard to justify spending a lot of resources on a card you think is going to be mediocre. However, with the Series 4 releases, people often were much more okay to spend 3,000 tokens on a card that they didn't think would be at the top of the meta, but it was still just kind of a fun thing to experiment and mess around with. Legion was a card that was viewed this way too. Obviously, he was way more powerful than Mirage, but at the time of his release, people weren't super sold on this card. But the fact that he was available for 3k tokens instead of 6k made people feel more comfortable taking a risk on the card, because even if they didn't end up using it a whole ton, you know, having some fun with it was worth 3k tokens to them, whereas 6k tokens was a way bigger investment. Now you could say, well, the spotlight keys and whatnot make it so the tokens don't matter as much, but I think that's actually the opposite of what's going on here, where the reason people valued using the tokens on the Series 4 ones is because then they could save their keys for the Series 5s they really wanted to get a hold of. Now, with every card being Series 5 on release, it feels like there is much more pressure from players in the community for every one of these cards to be like meta relevant and not just playable, but very strong. And I think the fact that we've had so many very, very strong releases in the past few months has kind of put even more pressure on this point. And ultimately, I think that's something that's kind of unsustainable, because like eventually you just start having to power creep harder and harder. We've seen it with all these 3/5s, right? Like 3/5s used to have like a kind of specific deck building condition, like Viper, Spider-Man, and whatnot. And now we're seeing way more generic 3/5s that can slot into any deck, like Nocturne before the nerf, Copycat, Red Guardian. Like, we're just getting way more of these cards at these push stat lines, whereas they used to have, I wouldn't say a downside per se, but more of a strong deck building requirement that a lot of these new pushed versions just do not have. So yeah, I just wanted to get some thoughts out there about this because I've seen so much discussion on Hulkling. I skipped Hulkling. I like the design of the card, but it's not a card I'm particularly interested in playing with. It doesn't super appeal to me and the things I want to do in the game, so I'm okay with skipping it, especially because there are so many strong, powerful cards that I'm looking forward to in the next 2 months, so I'm happy to save my resources. But I've seen a lot of people who really have enjoyed Hulkling in his current form, and I think it's being kind of overstated that this card is like a flop or this card desperately needs a buff, when I really don't think that is true or kind of a better outcome for the game overall. But that's just my take. I'd like to hear yours. Are you in the buff Hulkling camp? And particularly the thing I'm most interested in hearing about is thoughts on the whole, different series making people want more pushed cards. Because I think there is a very real sense of players looking to kind of justify their resource investment by making sure this card is like a big meta player. Otherwise, it creates this kind of feels bad where it's like, oh, I used my valuable resources and I got something that is not super valuable or useful. But yeah, that's going to wrap it up for this video. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoyed it, remember to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.